Last week, we saw how our world is changing for the better at an increasing rate. This wasn't a spiritual assessment. It was, I suppose, not even in a sense an optimistic one, but an assessment that was supported by data, by facts, by figures, and by statistics. I think, by the way, that in terms of feedback, some people felt that it was a little bit over-optimistic, that despite all the numbers that we were able to throw out and show the progress, they're still concerned that there's a huge amount of inequality in the world, that some of these innovations will be available only to the rich and not to the poorer parts of the world. So while everybody, I think, is in agreement that the world is changing in terms of its improvements, its length of life, and its benefits for the whole of mankind, not quite as rosy as the picture that we showed last week seems to be some of the feedback that I've had. But nevertheless, the graph is heading north, and it is definitely increasing in its pace. So this process of advancement fits in with the Jewish concept of a world moving toward a goal, which we discussed last week, and as it was predicted by the great prophets of Israel thousands of years ago. We're really not talking about some exotic event that has to be fitted into the biblical prophecies. We're talking about everything that is happening in our world, important trends, developments that impact upon our lives in significant ways. War and peace, poverty and wealth, health and longevity, all of these are steadily progressing towards in the direction of the messianic world that was described in dozens of those prophecies in the Torah. However, the redemption is not just about world peace or about universal prosperity or about curing diseases. In addition to the prophecies that we looked at last week, there are also prophecies that describe the rebuilding of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, the return of the Jewish people to their homeland, the restoration of Jewish unity and sovereignty, and the full implementation by all Jews of the commandments, the mitzvot, and that will reach a point at which all of humankind will recognize God and serve him. And Maimonides summarizes these prophecies, a small excerpt of which we read last week, in the closing chapters of the Mishnah Torah. And by the way, there are in the additional reading sections of your booklet, you'll see that there are citations from the prophets Isaiah and Amos and Zephaniah and Ezekiel and Joel and Jeremiah and Zechariah and Malachi, upon which Maimonides' description is actually based. So we have our first text tonight on page 45, text number 1. This is Maimonides' view of the Messianic age. And so can we have a read? And can I ask you when you read, please, to speak quite loudly, because I noticed in the recording that it was quite faint. The readers were quite faint, and those who are going to be listening to this after the event will have more difficulty hearing you unless you speak loudly. So any volunteer, please, to read text number 1 on page 45. Who's our first volunteer tonight?
Would you like me to read?
Thank you very much, Alan. Go for it.
The King Messiah is destined to arise and restore the sovereignty of the house of David to its former rule. He will build a temple and gather the dispersed of Israel. In his days, all the Torah law will be reinstated. When there arises a king from the house of David who studies Torah and fulfills the mitzvahs like his ancestor David, in accordance with both the written Torah and the oral Torah, and he will influence all of Israel to walk in its ways and repair its breaches, and he will fight the battle of God. He will presume to be Moshiach. If he does this and is successful, and he builds a temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, then he is definitely Moshiach. He will then improve the entire world to serve God together. As it is written, then I will transform the nations to a pure language that will all call upon the name of God and serve him with one purpose. In this era, there will be no famine or war, no envy or competition. For goodness will be in abundance, and all delights will be a commonplace as dust. The sole occupation of the world will be only to know God, as it is written, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God, and waters cover the sea.
Thank you. So he builds the temple and he gathers in the dispersed. Well, let's be brutally honest. Last week's prophecies were a much easier sell than the ones that we've just read. And I suppose the first question that comes to mind is all of this really necessary? I mean, we get the part about no famines and no wars and no poverty, but do we really need a holy temple and a world filled with the knowledge of God in order to cure disease, to eliminate poverty, to establish world peace? Perhaps one could argue that that is what a perfect world looks like 2,000 years ago, but that's not the world that we live in today. And so the question is, does our idea of a perfect world perhaps need to be updated? So the overarching question for tonight's session, therefore, is why do we need in inverted commas, a religious Moshiach? Maybe the world is a better place for all of its inhabitants. Make the world a better place for all of its inhabitants, and let's be done with it. That's all that we need. But that leads us to a second question. If God wanted a perfect world, why didn't he create it perfect from the outset? And behind these two questions lies the ultimate question. Why did God create the world? Scientists ask the question, how did the universe come about? Religion asks a much more exciting question. Why did it come about? What's its reason? What is its purpose? What did God need it for? And that's what we're going to try and answer tonight. Well, this question, why did God create the world, for a non-believer, is simply not a question. The universe came about through an accidental series of events that created the possibility of life. So you don't have to ask why, it just happened. But if you believe in God, and if you believe that God created the universe at some point, we're bound to ask ourselves the question, why? What is its purpose? Why does he need it? It's funny that this is actually not a question which we ever ask. And it's such an important one. Because if we don't have any sense of why God created the world, we have no idea what we're doing here. So these are the big questions that we're going to try and tackle tonight. And don't imagine that the answers come easily, because we have to draw upon the teachings of the Kabbalah in order to be able to expose these answers, to find them. But fortunately, these big ideas, hidden ideas in the Kabbalah, have been explained and made accessible through some of the key works of Chassidut, and in particular, the book of Tanya, which is known as the Bible of Chassidut, authored by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi in the 18th century, which we're going to be drawing on tonight and trying to make explicit. So, to begin to answer these big questions, we're going to need to delve deeper into what we could call the soul of the Messianic process, because everything has a body and a soul. And last week, what we were looking at were certain aspects of the body of the Messianic age, the actual physical circumstances that will prevail. But over the next 5 lessons, we're going to be exploring the soul, or its inner dynamics, what lies behind all of that, of how this new reality is created. How do we get to the point where we stand today? Where do we go from here? Why is this entire enterprise or journey necessary? And once we do that, we'll be able to find answers to the questions that we've just posed. So here's our slide. Why does the messianic goal of a better world require the universal recognition of God and the full implementation of Torah and mitzvot? Why isn't it enough to work for world peace and for the elimination of violence, poverty, and disease? And that sums up our first question. So our first step in exploring the inside story of Moshiach is to first of all try and understand the place that Moshiach holds within Judaism. And the truth of the matter is that the Messianic redemption is actually a hugely pervasive feature of Judaism. Mashiach is not just something that Jews believe will happen, it's actually woven into every thread of the fabric of Jewish history, of our faith, and of our psyche. And some of the strongest illustrations of this are actually in our 3 daily prayers, the Amidah, which are the central prayer when we stand before God to request our most intimate and our most pressing needs. Of the 19 blessings of the Amidah, 7 of them are about Moshiach and the redemption. And you'll see this in text number 2 on page 47. Now, we're not going to go through this whole long list, but just to pick out, you are mighty forever, Lord, you resurrect the dead, in prayer number 1. In the 7th blessing, behold our affliction, wave our battle, redeem us speedily for the sake of your name. 10th blessing, sound the great shofar for our freedom, raise a banner to gather our exiles, bring us together from the 4 corners of the earth. In the 14th blessing, return in mercy to Jerusalem, your city, and dwell therein as you have promised. Speedily therein establish the throne of David your servant, and rebuild it soon. The 15th blessing, speedily cause the Sion of David your servant to flourish, bring the Moshiach. So you see that much of the Amidah, 7 of the 19 blessings, touch on this theme. And these blessings, by the way, are an addition to the numerous requests for the coming of Moshiach and the rebuilding of the Holy Temple that are included in other parts of our daily prayers. And not only do we pray for the Moshiach 3 times a day, but we also express our yearning and our striving for the Messianic redemption at virtually every event and milestone in our lives. By the way, this is one of the big dividing points between Orthodox Judaism and other forms such as Reform or Liberal. They didn't believe in the Messianic age. They cut out all of these references to Mashiach in the Amidah and in all the other places where it appears. But we've retained them. Orthodox Jews have retained these blessings and these hopes for 3,000 years. So, for example, at a wedding celebration, the words of comfort spoken to mourner, which we'll see summarized in this next slide. There's our daily prayers, our meal times, our Jewish calendar, a Jewish wedding, death and mourning. So you can't pretend that the whole messianic shtick is something which simply is a little corner of Judaism that's relevant to some and irrelevant to everyone else. You can't be an Orthodox Jew without bumping into Mashiach concept pretty much in everything that you do during the day. And you'll see these items on the slide over here when you want to, in figure 2.1 on page 51, in which some of the ways in which Mashiach or the Messianic idea is mentioned at meal times in the Jewish calendar, at weddings and death and mourning, will be explained in that particular slide, in that particular figure 2.1. But actually, it goes even further than that. As we mentioned last week, Maimonides enumerated 13 principles of Jewish faith. And Maimonides refers to these 13 principles as the foundations of Judaism. And we're going to see them in the following video, and you'll also have them listed in your workbooks in figure 2.2 on page 53. But let's look at the video to start with.
Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, known in Hebrew by his acronym Rambam, and in English as Maimonides, was the Jewish star of the 12th century and a luminary for humanity. One of the greatest codifiers of Torah law and a giant of Jewish philosophy, he formulated a list of the 13 principles of Jewish faith, or as he described them, Judaism's fundamental truths and very foundation. To this day, Jewish communities worldwide recite or sing summarized versions of Maimonides' 13 principles. 1. God exists. God is the essence of perfection and the primary cause of all existence. 2. God is one. He is not a composite or divisible, but the most absolute and unparalleled unity. 3. God is non-corporeal. He has no body or part, and all references to God couched in the terms of human experience, such as movement, rest, seeing, and speaking, are metaphors. 4. God is eternal. This also means that nothing pre-existed God or brought God into being. 5. We must serve God exclusively. That precludes worshiping any entity or force that God created or that we have imagined. 6. God communicates through prophecy. It takes hard work to become spiritually fit for prophecy, and even then, communication is entirely God's choice and initiative. 7. The prophecy of Moses is supreme. God chose him from all humanity for all of time to receive the highest degree of prophetic experience. 8. The Torah is of divine origin. The Torah scrolls every word, along with the explanations that Moses delivered to us orally, is all from God's mouth. 9. The Torah is not susceptible to change. It was delivered by God in deliberate form and never can or will be amended in any way. 10. God knows everything. This includes God's active attention to each individual at every moment. 11. God rewards and penalizes. God communicated his expectations and gave us the ability to choose. He assures that our choices bear consequences. 12. There will be a Messiah and a Messianic era. A time will come in which the Torah will be fulfilled in entirety, and we will fully benefit from the blessings that will ensure as a result. The Messianic era will be conducted by a mortal Messiah, a descendant of King David, who will become an unparalleled global leader. We must constantly anticipate his arrival. 13. There will be a resurrection of the dead. At some point, God will restore the departed souls of the righteous from heaven and recreate their bodies to participate in and benefit from a perfected world. These principles begin with God as the primary cause of existence and conclude with a perfected world. Our ancient sages revealed that the reason that God created all that exists is for us to actively build the perfected world of the Messianic era.
Phew, that's quite a big menu to swallow, isn't it? But the interesting thing is that if we look at the other items on this shortlist, we see that faith in the coming of Moshiach is as important to Judaism as things like belief in God, the oneness of God, the divinity of the Torah, reward and punishment. It stands alongside them. And the implication, therefore, is that without belief in Moshiach, the whole of Judaism is lacking something in its very foundations. So the questions we need to ask are, why is the belief and yearning for Moshiach so very central to Jewish life? And what makes the belief in Moshiach so fundamental to Judaism? And that's what we see in this next slide. Well, one way to look at it would be to say that this is a direct response to our collective experience as a persecuted people. For much of our 3,800-year history, we've been exiled, we've been enslaved, we've been forcefully converted, we've been expelled, we've been massacred, we've been vilified and humiliated. Wouldn't you want a Moshiach if you had to go through all of that? And it's clear that the firm belief in God's promise of our eventual redemption has been an important factor in what has enabled us to persevere and survive for all of this. So is this a fiction that we have created as a survival mechanism? And if that is the case, then it may no longer be relevant, because today, for the most part, we enjoy prosperity and freedom. We have our own state. Has this made Mashiach less of a Jewish goal today and much more of a universal tikkun olam, fixing the world kind of goal? Well, while it's certainly true that our faith in the promised redemption has enabled us to survive what no other people have survived, but it's really not the whole story. In fact, if we take a closer look at the source for Mashiach in the Torah, we see very clearly that Mashiach is not a response to galut, to exile. It actually goes all the very way back to the Bible, to the beginning of the Bible. And you'll see this in text number 3 on page 55. If somebody would like to read it. Taken from Deuteronomy, from the Bible itself, before we went into these exiles. Someone, please?
I'll come in, Rabbi Shlomo.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi. Hashem will return your exiles, and he will have mercy upon you. He will return and gather you from all the nations amongst whom God has scattered you. If your outcasts will be at the ends of the heavens, from there Hashem will gather you. From there he will take you. Hashem will bring you into the land your ancestors possessed, and you will possess it. And he will do you good and multiply you more than your ancestors. And you will return and listen to the voice of Hashem and fulfill all his commandments.
So you see, this is embedded already in the Torah long before we suffered all of those exiles. And that's just to indicate that the idea of Mashiach can't simply be a longing which comes about because of exile. And that's what we want to show in the next two slides, in the next slide rather. Mashiach is not just a solution to our exile. Moshe prophesied about the exile and the redemption at the same time. So Moses spoke these words more than 3,300 years ago, when the children of Israel had yet to enter the promised land, much less even to be exiled from it. Moses is prophesying both the exile and the redemption, both an abandonment of God and a return to God, before either of these have taken place. And similarly with many other messianic prophecies, of which on which Maimonides' description is based, were proclaimed by the prophets 2,500 years ago, many years before the destruction of even the first temple. So clearly then, to believe in Mashiach is not a product or a response to galut, to exile, but it is a promise and a principle embedded throughout all of our liturgy and in our Torah that precedes the galut by many centuries. In fact, it goes even beyond that. Our sages actually took this a step further, and they trace the messianic principle to the very opening verses of the Torah and the very origins of the world's creation. Take a look at text 4a on page 56. I'm going to read it because it's a short one. It's taken, of course, from Genesis, the beginning of the creation of the world. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was chaotic and desolate, and darkness was on the face of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God hovered upon the waters. V'ruach Elokim merachefet al panei hamayim. And, says Rabbeinu Bachia in text number 4b on page 57, the following in regard to this text. The Spirit of God hovered upon the waters. This is the soul of the Moshiach. The meaning of this midrash is, in this passage, God is foretelling the end at the beginning. The Torah's intention is to indicate the end of time at the very beginning of time, to teach us that the ultimate purpose of God's creation of the world is, in fact, the days of Moshiach, and thus the original thought is actualized in the conclusion of the work. So the Torah is telling us here that the world in its original state was chaotic and desolate and full of darkness, but there was something else going on as well. There was a Spirit of God that was hovering over the waters, and that is the Messianic Spirit, the end, which is already present at the beginning. So the ultimate purpose of God's creation of the world is the days of the Moshiach. That positions Moshiach within Judaism, and that's what we set out to do first. But the last point we discussed raises this troubling question. It's the second of the three questions which we articulated at the beginning of the lesson. If the Messianic era truly represents the world that God desired from the start, why wasn't the world created in that state in the first place? Because last week we saw human history described as a progression. God created a world, but initially it was chaotic, it was violent, it was a hardship-ridden place for the great majority of its inhabitants. And it still is for very, very many people. But then gradually over the centuries, the world became more enlightened, more prosperous, more peaceful. Even back in its darkest period, though, the prophets who speak for God, the creator of this entire enterprise, predicted and promised that there will be a messianic end. So if this is the world that God wanted, why didn't he make it that way? Why do we have to go through this entire process of struggling with an imperfect world? Well, to answer this question, we need to back up a little bit more as well. We know now that the purpose of creation will be fulfilled in the Messianic era. That much we have learnt. But we still don't understand what this purpose is, why God made a world. That, of course, is the third and the key question of our three questions that will unlock the answers to this whole Moshiach business. Well, I suppose, how can we ever know why God created the world? To the best of my knowledge, there's no one around today who was there at that time. So how would we know why God created the world? Well, the ancient Kabbalists believed that God revealed his secret to them. And there are three key passages in the book of Tanya, our texts 5 to 7, that will take this Kabbalistic interpretation and address this question of why God created the world head on. So hang on for the ride, because we're going to try and analyze each of them. We're going to start with text number 5 on page 60. Now just remember, please, that these texts are very deep Hasidic philosophy. They're written in a particular style. As we read them, you won't necessarily get it, but we're going to unpack it and make it intelligible and try and make it real so that everybody can understand what we're trying to get at. Let's start, therefore, with a reader for text number 5 on page 60. It's a short one, so anybody you'd like.
I'll have a go.
Thank you.
Okay, the primordial desire. As is known, the sages have said that the purpose of the creation of this world is that God desired that he should have a home in the lowly world. It is also known that the days of Moshiach, and especially the time of the resurrection of the dead, are the fulfillment and culmination of the creation of this world, and the purpose for which it was originally created.
Okay, so in this passage over here, Tanya reiterates something which we've already seen in text number 4b, that Moshiach is the fulfillment of God's purpose in creating the world. The Tanya, however, also provides us with a one-line mission statement that encapsulates what the purpose of creation was. And the way he puts it is, God desired that he would have a home in the lowly world. And that's the phrase that we're going to have to try and understand. Well, first of all, what is the lowly world? The Hebrew phrase is tachtonim. The word tachat in Hebrew means at the bottom. If we could be rude for a moment, in Yiddish, if you want to talk about a person's backside, you call it his tochas, because it is tachat, it's at the bottom. But the word tachtonim is the Kabbalistic term for our physical world, which we are translating as a lowly world, as opposed to higher spiritual realms, which are also part of God's creation. So what the Tanya is saying in this little passage over here is that despite the existence of these higher spiritual realms, God desired that our lowly world should be developed as, quote, unquote, a home for God, whatever that means. And we'll see. And this is then further emphasized in another key passage in Tanya, which is text number 6 on page 61. And once again, we shall need a reader for this short piece. All right, it's very short. Let me read it. This is what the human being is all about. This is the purpose of the human being's creation and of the creation of the worlds, both the lofty and the lowly, that God should have his home in the lowly world. It seems almost like a repetition of what we've already learnt. So let's see that in this slide over here. The purpose of creation. Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. This was to show us, a slide that I missed, how central Moshiach is in all of the different contexts. Okay, the purpose of creation is for God to have a dwelling place in the lowly world. So once again, in this passage, Tanya is emphasizing that while there may be many worlds, both lofty, higher, and lower, God specifically desires the home we make for him here in our lowly physical world. In fact, this is the purpose, says Tanya, for which God created the world, all the worlds, both the high and the lowly. Why are we referring to our world as the lowly world? Granted that there may be spiritual realms that are holier and higher than our physical material world, but why do we need to insult our world by calling it lowly? Why not just call it simply the physical world or the lowest world? The term lowly is almost a slightly pejorative term, and that's intentional. The Tanya addresses this point in the next text that we're going to read. Now this text is rather long and philosophical, but it holds the key to answering the questions we posed in the beginning of this class. So we're going to study this next text very carefully, and after we've read it, we're going to break it up into its constituent parts and analyze it and explain it, because it is our key text for tonight. In fact, the text is actually a continuation of the first part of text 5, that after stating that the purpose of creation is God's desire that he should have a home in the lowly world, Tanya now goes on to explain the following. And this is text number 7 on page 63. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read it to you. Page 63 again. Now, in regard to God, the distinctions of higher and lower do not apply, as God pervades all realms of existence equally. But the explanation of the matter is as follows. Before the world was created, God was exclusively and singularly one, and he pervaded the entire space in which he created the world. Insofar as God is concerned, it's still the same now. The change brought about by the divine act of creation relates only to those on the receiving end of the vitality and energy that God infuses into creation, which they receive via the many garments that conceal and obscure the divine radiance. As it is written, "For no human can see me and live." This is the concept of Hishtalshelut, the downward descent of the worlds, level after level, by means of the multitude of garments that conceal the energy and vitality that emanate from God, until this physical and materialistic world was created, which is the lowest in degree, of which there is none lower in regard to the concealment of God's radiance. This is a world of doubled and redoubled darkness, to the extent that it is full of unholiness, namely elements that actually oppose God, declaring, "I am, and there is nothing else besides me." Clearly, the purpose of the Hishtalshelut of the worlds and the descent level after level is not for the sake of the higher spiritual worlds, as they constitute a descent from the radiance of the divine presence. Rather, the ultimate purpose of creation is this lowest world, for such was God's desire, that he would derive satisfaction when the forces opposing godliness are overcome and when darkness is transformed into light. The result in that infinite radiance of God, the result is that the infinite radiance of God is revealed within this physical world, the place of darkness and the opposing forces, with the, quote, "the advantage of the light that comes from darkness," close quote from Ecclesiastes, with an even greater intensity than its revelation in the highest worlds. You get all of that? Let's plunge into it. But show you this next slide first. Now, I'm not sure, by the way, whether this next slide is the best one they could have chosen to depict the process of darkness to light, but here it is. So you've got some clean sneakers that become progressively more dirty as they come down. So the sneakers at the bottom of the slide now represent our world, and the sneakers at the top of the slide represent the pristine clarity of the highest world. And then our task is to polish our sneakers so that all the dirt disappears and darkness turns to light. Okay? The two central ideas in this text that we've just read are the following. The meaning of higher and lower in God's creation is encapsulated in a very central Kabbalistic concept called Hishtalshelut, described in the text as the descent of the worlds. And the second central idea is why God desires a home specifically in our lowly world. Now, as we discuss these two concepts, and yes, we are in a very philosophical mode tonight, and it's very different to last week, but just hang in there with me if you can. I'm not seeing you, so I don't know whether you're asleep or whether you're still there. I'm just trying to explain the text. As we discuss these concepts, we're going to come back to read and reread and explain the parts of the text that we just read. First of all, let's start with this term, Hishtalshelut, the descent of the worlds, that I've said is a very central idea in the Kabbalah. The Hebrew word Hishtalshelut comes from the Hebrew word shalshelet, which means a chain, a linked chain. It also means a descent, that there's a sequence of downward steps or levels in which each step or level is lesser or lower than the preceding step. So the Hishtalshelut is the interconnected chain-like process by which the spiritual energy of the Creator descends through successive levels or stages to ultimately create a physical world. It is the way in which the infinite God creates a finite world. By the way, when I first encountered the concept of Hishtalshelut in my studies many years ago, I had an image in my mind of a slinky toy. Do you remember a slinky toy? Anybody know that? Remember, that's one of those kind of like compressed cylindrical springs, and you put it on the top step and you stretch it down to the next step, and then it walks its way down from step to step, from level to level. Remember that? That's my image of Hishtalshelut. So according to the teachings of Kabbalah, our world, the material world that we inhabit and which we experience as physical beings, is actually only one of many worlds that God created. Physicists, of course, wonder about the existence of other worlds. But we're talking here about the coexisting spiritual worlds that are present, but which are beyond our perception. So creation as a whole is a Hishtalshelut, a chain of many worlds or realms of reality, each one lesser and lower than the preceding one. And our physical world is the lowest link in this chain of worlds. In a certain sense, I think the Hishtalshelut, or the order of the Hishtalshelut, is kind of like the DNA of the creative process that brought the world into being and sustains it. And by the way, the Kabbalists understood the intricate details of this spiritual DNA long before scientists unlocked the secrets of the physical human genome. While the Hishtalshelut, this downward process of descent from the most spiritual down to the most physical, consists of many myriad stages and levels, in general terms, Kabbalah speaks of 4 general worlds in the following descending order. You have this in your workbooks in figure 2.4 on page 65, but you can see them here in the next slide. Those are the 4 worlds which we're going to look at in a moment. So as you can see, and I hope that you're still with me in this explanation, as you can see, the highest level, Atzilut, the world of emanation, that's the highest one, and the lowest one is Asiyah, the world of action. That's the physical world that we inhabit and that defines our everyday experience of reality. What makes the world of Atzilut the highest world in the chain of creation, and our physical world the lowest in the chain? And that is the point that Tanya comes to address in text 7 that we just read. Because obviously higher and lower in this context can't be meant in a spatial sense. You don't get from Asiyah to Atzilut by traveling upward in a lift or a spaceship. And even Elon Musk is not going to get there in one of his spaceships. Clearly, we're talking about higher and lower in a conceptual sense. And significantly, Tanya in this little piece rejects the definition of higher and lower as referring to the degree in which God is present, which would assume that in the lower world, God is less present, and in the higher world, God is more present. Tanya rejects that, and the Kabbalists as expressed by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, wants to be able to say that God is present in all worlds equally. What then makes one higher and the other one lower? And the answer is, it is something to do about not degrees of presence or absence, but rather by degrees of revelation and concealment. You see, a thing can be present but not recognized because it's hidden, it's concealed. Here's an example. If there's such a thing as ghosts in the world, would you know that they are present with you in the room right now? Because usually they don't reveal themselves. You know, they could be right here with us, and we wouldn't even know, because they're concealed. We don't sense them. Imagine two rooms. Room A has 20 top physicists in it, and room B has 20 children. Now consider Einstein's great discovery, E equals mc squared. The reality of that formula is present equally in both rooms, but it is only revealed in the room which is occupied by the physicists. In the room of the children, it is concealed. And so it is with the chain-like succession of the worlds. There are degrees of revelation of God's presence in the higher worlds and concealment in the lower worlds. As a matter of fact, the Hebrew word for world, olam, is related to the word helem, concealment. You'll see this in figure 2.5 on page 66, but we'll also show this in the next slide. Can you see how olam and helem are the same letters? Our world has a name which indicates that God is concealed and hidden within it. So a world, any world, even the highest world, Atzilut, by definition, is a certain state of concealment, with greater concealment as you move down through the worlds. Under conditions of full revelation, only God can exist. There's no space for anything else other to exist. In order for a world to come into being, God has to, so to speak, hide his presence. And therefore, the divine act of creation is actually an act of concealment. And within creation itself, the various worlds which are described in the Hishtalshalut are defined by their degree of concealment. A lesser concealment of God produces a higher world, while a greater concealment produces a lower world. Now, let's come back to our world, the world of Asiyah, that we have described as lowly, or the lowest world. Now we understand why it's called lowly. It's called lowly because this is the world in which God's presence is most profoundly concealed. There are, of course, many people who believe in God and do their best to live a godly life. But you see, one of the things about our world is that belief in God is a choice. A person can choose to believe or choose not to believe. A person can choose to follow God's will or not. It's even possible in our world to deny God's existence entirely and to postulate that our world is a completely independent existence, a self-contained, self-sufficient reality. And all of that is only possible because we don't see or sense God in our world, because he is concealed in our world. as we read in text 7. So God pervades all realms of existence. But if he pervaded all realms of existence without any concealment, his presence would be so manifest, so pervasive, that the choice to believe or not to believe wouldn't exist. You couldn't deny the existence of God if you saw him clearly with your own eyes, if you knew that he existed. But you don't. So therefore you have a choice. That's because he's concealed. One really cannot underestimate the far-reaching consequences of this act of divine self-concealment. The concealment of God reaches to the very core of our perception and awareness of self. We conceive ourselves as distinct, autonomous human beings. If we were truly to see or sense divine reality not as an abstract idea, we could no longer maintain our own self-perception as something independent of God. We would cease to exist as autonomous, freely choosing human beings. And nor would we be able or capable of seeing any existence as something that exists independently of God. And that is what Tanya wants to tell us in text number 8 on page 67. And this time, a reader, please.
I'll do it.
Thank you. Thank you.
If the eye were allowed to see, the fact that every creation and event appears to us as a tangible and real is only because we do not apprehend and see with our physical eyes the godly energy and divine breath within each creation. But if the eye were allowed to see and apprehend the vitality and spirituality being infused into every creation by the divine utterance, the physicality, materiality, and substance of that creation would be utterly invisible to us. As such, there is literally nothing, there is nothing besides him.
And that is what we say in our prayers, Ein od milvado. There's nothing else beside him, but we don't sense it. We're blind to it. Our antennae don't pick it up. We can't see it with our eyes, and we can't sense it even with our souls, because we live in a world of deep, profound concealment. God has concealed himself. King David said in Psalms, Achen ata kel mistata, oh, but you are a God who hides himself. And where is he most profoundly hidden? In our world. God's concealment allows us to possess a sense of self and perceive ourselves as an existence. It's a big idea to get our heads around, but a very key one. So now let's come back for a moment to figure 2.3, the four main worlds, Atzilut, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. The first and the highest world, Atzilut, is one in which God's concealment is slight. The next two worlds, Bria and Yetzirah, feature progressively greater degrees of concealment. The lowest level of the Hishtalshelut is the physical world of Asiya, the one that we inhabit. In this world, the garments that conceal the energy and the vitality that emanate from God, quoting from Tanya, have increased, as we have been saying, to such a degree, to the point where the world is, quoting again from Tanya, a doubled and redoubled darkness. It is full of unholiness, and it even features elements that directly oppose and defy the existence of God. And for this reason, it is described as lowly. And so you see, our physical world is therefore the ultimate paradox. Its very existence is completely dependent on the divine creative force that generates it. and yet it is completely oblivious to the true nature of its own existence, to the extent that it is even capable of denying the existence of its creator and acting against his will. And yet, as Tanya concludes, God desired that this lowly world, this place of concealment, should be made into a home for him. In fact, all the higher worlds exist for this purpose. The entire spiritual infrastructure of creation is there to empower us here in this lowly world to transform it into this phrase, a home that God desires. And Tanya's proof that the whole purpose of creation and all the higher worlds is for this lowly world that we inhabit is laid out in the 4th paragraph of text 7, in which it said, the part that we read, clearly the purpose of the Hishtalshelut of the worlds and their descent, level after level, is not for the sake of the higher spiritual worlds, as they constitute descent from the radiance of the divine presence. Rather, the ultimate purpose of creation is this lowest world. Tanya's logic, listen carefully, goes as follows. If God's aim in creating the world was to express godliness and spirituality, then the most godly and spiritual world would be no world at all. Because any world, even the highest world, represents a degree of hiddenness, of godliness and spirituality. For even the highest of all the created worlds, Atzilut, is a level of concealment of God's presence, albeit at a very refined level. And there's further concealment in the descent of the worlds. So this leads us now to an astonishing conclusion. In creating the world, God was seeking not revelation, but concealment. Not godliness and spirituality, but a reality in which godliness and spirituality is obscured, concealed, and suppressed. That is what he wanted in the creation of the world. And our physical world, the lowest of all the worlds, is the place where that concealment is most profoundly expressed. And if that is what God wanted in creating the world, then our world is in fact the end goal of creation. Now that is a surprise. Doesn't that turn it on its head? God created the world because he wanted a place of concealment rather than a place of spirituality and revelation. Why? Why does God desire a flawed, imperfect, even antagonistic world in which to make his home? And the answer to that lies in the last segment of text number 7, that key text that we've been looking at. Because there, the Tanya explains that it was God's desire that he should derive satisfaction when the forces opposing godliness are overcome, when darkness is transformed into light, causing the infinite light of God to be revealed in this physical world with an even greater intensity than its revelation in the higher worlds. Let's play God for a moment and ask ourselves this question. If I was perfect in every way, infinite, eternal, utterly self-sufficient, what would there still be for me to desire? It would seem that there's nothing that a perfect being could desire, because a perfect and all-powerful being doesn't lack anything, doesn't need anything. But there are certain things that a perfect being doesn't have, precisely because of its perfection and omnipotence. A perfect, all-powerful being doesn't experience challenge, as there's nothing that poses a challenge to it. A perfect and all-powerful one and only being, doesn't experience achievement, as there's nothing for it to possess or to achieve. A perfect and powerful being has no relationships and no partnerships, because relationships, partnerships imply mutual need. If I don't need anything from you and you don't need anything from me, if there's nothing that I can give you and nothing that you can give me, there's no relationship between us. And there's certainly no partnership. Let's break this up with a slide. Perfection does not experience any of these things. Challenge, achievement, relationship, partnership doesn't exist for perfection. Of course, God doesn't really need any of these things. The first foundation of Jewish belief that we saw in Maimonides is that God is absolutely perfect, self-sufficient God, but God, according to the Kabbalists, their understanding, God desired these things. And paradoxically, therefore, the one thing that a perfect being could desire and that is not present in perfection is imperfection. And so God, according to the Kabbalah, creates an imperfect world, our physical world, in which his presence is deeply concealed through successive veils of concealment that obscures the truth of his existence to such an extent that this world experiences itself as a reality that is disconnected from and even hostile to its creator. As a result, it is flawed and corrupt. And into this world, he places mortal, flawed human beings who are challenged by the spiritual vacuum around them, who strive to achieve a recognition of God, who in the course of their lives have to enter into interactions with other human beings to form relationships of interdependent need. And if we are successful in our efforts, we bring light to places of darkness and to places of opposing forces. And then, in the words of Tanya, quoting King Solomon in Ecclesiastes, we bring about, quote, the superiority of light that comes from darkness, which by implication is a higher and a brighter light than the one that shines without struggle. And in that, we fulfill the purpose of creation. That is what God desired in creating the world. In placing us in this lowly world, we become God's partners in creation, a phrase that we'll come back to analyze in a later lesson. Tasked to repair this flawed world by revealing the divine goodness and the perfection that it already possesses. Our job is to make a diamond from coal. And that is the Kabbalist's answer to the question, why did God create the world, as articulated by Chassidut in the book of Tanya. And this, therefore, leads us to answer our very first question tonight. If God wanted a perfect world, why didn't he make it that way in the first place? Because we now understand that the word perfect world is an oxymoron. World means concealment. Perfect means total revelation that excludes the possibility of world. By definition, world is actually imperfect. Because there's something even greater than perfection. An imperfect world that perfects itself. This is a world that fulfills the divine desire for challenge, achievement, and partnership and relationships. The world is therefore created in its most imperfect state, and over the successive centuries, we continue to improve it to the point where ultimately we can call it a home for God. And that is why the Midrash tells us that everything that was created in the 6 days of creation all required further work. Text number 10 on page 70. It's a short one, so I shall read it. Everything that was created in the 6 days of creation requires further doing. The mustard seed needs to be tempered. Legumes need to be softened. Grain needs to be milled. Even human beings require fixing. And Rashi says this is the meaning of what it says, that all his work which God created to make. The Torah doesn't say created and made, but rather created to make. That is to teach us everything in this world requires fixing. The world was not created perfect for a reason, but it was left to us to make it perfect. Finally, for tonight, the following quotation from Isaiah leads us to answer the overarching question with which we started tonight. Our question was, who needs a Moshiach? Why do we need a religious Moshiach? Why is the universal recognition and knowledge of God such a core component of the Messianic redemption? Why not just work for world peace? Text number 11 on page 71 relates to this. It's a quotation from Isaiah, uncloaking the divine. No longer shall your master be cloaked. Your eyes will see your master. It is our task to lift the veil, to remove the concealment, to draw back the curtain, to show the underlying godliness that is present in the world. Because remember, God is present equally in all the worlds in the same way. It's just that he is more hidden in some than in others. So, the Messianic process is a body and a soul. And we've started tonight to discuss the spiritual dimension, this soul part of the body. The imperative to reveal God's presence is the soul, or the inner engine of the process that underpins and explains the astonishing physical changes that we're seeing in the world. The two go hand in hand, because the Messianic process has to have both the body and a soul, and the body is the physical changes we're seeing in the world. The soul, or the inner engine of the process, is the fact that our world is progressively developing as a home for God in the lowly world. Body and soul. So the flaws and the shortcomings that beset our world, causing death and destruction of people and the whole natural order, are direct outcomes of the concealment that obscure the goodness and the perfection of the creation, of the Creator. If that goodness and perfection were fully manifest, revealed in our world, there wouldn't be the possibility of greed or violence or ignorance or poverty. And as our world develops into a home for God, these phenomena are gradually, slowly being alleviated. And as a consequence, there are reductions, imperfect reductions albeit, in violence, illness, poverty in the world, all the things we spoke about in lesson 1. Of course, all of this is happening because of the efforts of scientists and educators and activists and philanthropists across the globe. But the inner dynamic that empowers these changes is the work of humanity and our work as Jews, as God's partners in creation. The more we increase our awareness of God, the more we make God present in our lives, we unveil a bit more of the concealment and expose the inherent goodness in the world. And it is true that there is a massive disconnect in this regard between body and soul. Those who are responsible for great advancements in the physical world may not believe or even be aware of God. And conversely, those who spend their lives cloistered in spiritual pursuits may not be aware of the global implications of their efforts. That too is part of the concealment. But the rule of the universe is that body does not exist without soul, even when you can't see the connection. If making God more present in the world, therefore, is the driving force behind its trajectory towards greater perfection, the million-dollar question that we're left with tonight is, how do we achieve this? And for the answer to that question, I'm afraid you'll have to tune in again next week. But for the moment, here is our summary video for tonight.
Lesson 2. Who needs a redemption? 1. Moshiach is more than a Jewish belief. It is one of the 13 foundations of Judaism and pervades every area of Jewish observance, Jewish history, and the Jewish consciousness. Judaism sees Moshiach and the future redemption as the purpose for which God created the world and the goal of everything we do. 2. Like everything in existence, Moshiach has both a body and a soul. The body of Moshiach, its outer physical reality, is the perfect world described by the prophets, a world of universal peace and prosperity. But this is only the external expression of an internal spiritual dynamic that empowers our progress toward this perfected world. 3. The soul of Moshiach is the process by which, through our observance of the mitzvot, the world is brought into harmony with its creator and comes to fully express the goodness and perfection of God. Hasidic teaching describes this process as the goal to make a home for God in the lowly world. 4. Our physical world is the lowliest in the chain of the worlds that constitute God's creation. This is not because God is any less present in it. The divine reality equally pervades all realms of existence. But because it is here that godliness is most concealed, allowing for a world that can act contrary to the will of its creator and even deny God's existence. All the flaws and imperfections that plague our world are the product of this concealment. 5. Our task in life is to serve as God's partners in creation and developing the messianic world. As a perfect being, God experiences challenge and achievement through us when we transform our lives and environment into a home that expresses the divine goodness and perfection, resulting in the advantage of the light that comes from the darkness.
So, what do you make of that? Too heavy? Too philosophical?
It's brilliant.
It was good. It was good. It was good.
Brilliant.
Very clear. Clear as mud, I would say.
I think there's a sort of a dynamic tension, isn't there, all the way through, and in particular the challenge of the COVID crisis, which has enabled, I would venture to suggest, some revelation because of the invention of the vaccine. So you had a situation of darkness and then the emanation of light in terms of saving life, Pekuach Nefesh, and working towards the globe. It's amazing, So,
but isn't it a really radical and brilliant insight to say that the perfect God created the world because he wanted imperfection, because out of imperfection comes struggle and difficulty, and you can turn imperfection, if you turn imperfection into something better, it is so much more powerful than a world which is just perfect from the outset? Don't we all know? Don't we have this enormous admiration when we encounter people who have suffered the most incredible setbacks in their lives in terms of health and they struggle and persevere, and they come through it shining, and we look at those human beings and say, these are the inspirational human beings of our world, compared to somebody who's had it good all their life and is born with a silver spoon in their life and never had a day's problem, etc. They're not the heroes that we praise. There's something about turning something rotten into something good that lies at the very essence of this whole story, and that is what the Kabbalists actually grasp. This whole idea that there's this deep, profound concealment, and that it's our job to reveal, to bring out to show the godliness in the world, and it comes with huge struggle. That the world in which that we occupy is just so ungodly, so not believing, that you're just a minority, aren't you? A minority voice, shouting out a message that seemingly nobody else wants to hear. And along comes the command and says, yes, that's exactly what God wanted.
I think you're being a bit naive, Shlomo, because the truth is we're not just talking about people that face challenges in life and good comes out of it. I'm afraid that old chestnut, the Holocaust, still bewilders me. I mean, what good? I know Israel was founded. I know people found belief and people didn't. But what good did that really do to mankind and each of those victims that were murdered? I can't see that there was a God that meant that to happen and that we'd get strength out of it. I really can't. By mentioning Holocaust, it takes us into an area in which there are genuinely no answers, Marilyn. We're not ever... Yeah, but I know.
Well,
it's the darkness, isn't it? It was the darkness. And eventually there came light.
Yeah,
out of that darkness.
Hang on a second, somebody else wanted to say something? Who was that? Was it Alan? Want to say something?
Actually,
Ilan, okay.
If I may, thank you for letting me ask a question. So I was just wondering if to Marilyn's point, it's something I've thought about a lot. And I was wondering, maybe this is a question for Marilyn, is if the Shoah had to happen to catalyze certain events and lessons for the Moshiach to come about, would that justify it? That's just a question for Marilyn, actually.
Yeah.
And a question for Shlomo, if I may, which is something that I haven't quite properly understood yet, is if Hashem is the quintessence of perfection and unity and shalom and shalom, why does Hashem need to create a universe? What is the animus?
And so
Hashem somehow deficient.
And so what Tanya says, he doesn't need, but he desired. He wanted to. Going to come back to you, Francine, in a moment. This was a pleasure, so to speak, a pleasure for him to be able to see a dark world, acknowledging and recognizing him over a period of time. That is what he actually desired, as opposed to needed. And that's as far as you can go, Ilan. You can't go anywhere further than that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Francine?
Marilyn?
No, Francine first. No, sorry.
That's right.
A question. If in the vastness of creation, and God created, that energy created this vastness and our world, is there a suggestion that there are other worlds in which there are parallel exercises? Let's call this an exercise that's bracketed by Hashem, our world as we know it. Is there another world?
With another experiment going on.
Exactly.
Yeah. It is part of Jewish belief that this whole descent of worlds, etc., spiritual worlds, created this one single physical world, that this is the only experiment which is which we're undergoing at the moment. And I once asked Rabbi Din Steinsaltz, who was a very wise man, and a deep Kabbalist, by the way, and always saw things from a different perspective to anybody else that I know. I said to him, Rabbi Adin, why did God create such a rotten world? Yes, I understand. He wanted imperfection, and he wanted us to be able to find him, to reveal him when in his concealment. But did he have to do it in such a way? Did he have to plant in this world such cruel people? Did there have to be so much suffering? Did there have to be a Holocaust with millions of people, innocent people, losing their lives? I get what he wanted, but maybe he could have done it in a slightly kinder way. And he said to me, Shlomo, when a scientist sets up an experiment, the only way in which he's going to be able to see whether that experiment works is when he takes it to the last extreme, at the point at which it's going to break. That's where he tests his theory. He doesn't test it in the part which is nice and easy. And you take it to breaking point.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Well,
could you please repeat it?
That is my Siri not understanding why the world was created, and frankly, I don't blame Siri for one moment.
I'm not sure I understand.
Siri, why was the world created? Hey Siri, why was the world created?
Okay, I found this on the web for why was the world created. Check it out.
There are no valid scientific data or calculations to substantiate. Oh, somewhere here. The answer is that Siri bucked the question and gave me a whole bunch of websites to work through. For my money, I think I'd rather spend my time with Tanya, because it actually does a bit more for me than some of these websites.
That Tanya's hard, Rabbi.
Whoever said it should be easy.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah.
Very difficult, very difficult.
When I first encountered, I studied philosophy at university, I was very keen to try and find answers to life and to the universe, etc. So I majored in philosophy. I was really disappointed because I didn't find any of the answers. Fascinating philosophy, Kant and Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein and everybody else, but nobody gave me the answers, the real answers that I was looking for. And then I landed up in this Hasidic yeshiva in Israel, 1968. So we're talking a long time ago, just after the 1967 war, the beginning of the Baal Teshuvah movement. And I had a study partner who was an American boy who just spent a few months, quite a long time in an ashram, and he'd been heavily into drugs, LSD and other things. And the two of us sat down from completely different backgrounds. I wasn't into drugs and I hadn't done that kind of stuff. And we started to bash our heads against these texts. And we both got very excited. He got excited because he said, hey, he said, I saw these ideas. I saw them when I was high. This is where I was. Now it's been explained to me. And I got excited because I suddenly realized that the key decisions I was trying to make in my life about whether I was going to pursue an observant Jewish life or throw the whole thing aside, I'd seen only a religion that focused on ritual, a bunch of old men shuffling around in a shul, etc. It didn't have any meaning. Yes, there were festivals. Suddenly, in these texts, I realized Judaism actually has something to say. It actually does confront some of these big issues. Yes, it's hard, and you get your head around it. You've got to struggle a bit, and you've got to try and make sense of it. And you can't dumb it down because there are difficult texts, etc. But it just opened a whole new dimension of Judaism that just lifted us, it excited us, gave us a sense there's something here. It's not just about ritual, bunch of people mumbling, "Vahi bin Saharon, Vayomer Moshe." There's something more to it. Yeah, and that's what was so exciting. That's what grabbed us. That's what grabbed a whole generation of young American Jews and subsequently Jews across the world. The realization that for the first time, these ideas were being made explicit in a way that was becoming accessible to us. And here what we're doing in a course of this kind is taking these ideas and trying to make them even more accessible. I wouldn't say we're dumbing them down, but we're taking little extracts, little pieces, and we're trying to put them together and explain them in nice, easy, comfortable language, as much as we can. But they are difficult ideas. They're very central ideas. One should not imagine for a moment that one is going to grapple with some of these big questions and find trite answers. They're always going to be complicated. And they're always going to be answers that only part of us is going to accept. And another part of us is going to say, nah, I can't live with that. It's going to throw up these conflicts in us. But that's great, because it's challenging us to think differently. I said at the very outset, I'm not selling, and I'm not expecting anybody to buy. This is offering this conversation, these texts, as a way for people to encounter them on their own terms, each one, and to take from it whatever works for you. Accept it, reject it, but at least you're exposed to another dimension, another way of thinking, a different way of seeing Judaism from an entirely different perspective, an inner perspective, even if one doesn't accept all of the answers. And I don't have answers to you, Marilyn, about the Holocaust. And yes, of course, we're being slightly naive, and it's easy to bandy around words like reveal and conceal, etc. We're going to go much more deeply into what does it mean to make a home for God, and we'll extend some of these concepts. What does a partnership mean? Those are the courses coming up. But even after we've finished all of that, do I get it all? Does it all